This is the Cheyenne Roundup, a weekly look at Wyoming's legislative session from Wyoming Public Radio and WyoFile. I'm Chris Clements, Wyoming Public Radio's State House reporter, and with me is WyoFile's state government and politics reporter, Maggie Mullen.
Hey, Chris. Good to be here in the Wyoming Capitol's media room.
Yes-sirree, Bobcat Tail. It's 9 a.m. on Friday, February 7th. This past Thursday was the halfway point in the general session, and the legislature is starting to hit a bunch of deadlines. For instance, we're passing a deadline for bills to clear committee in their chamber of origin. You can sort of feel it in the air that we've reached the halfway point, too. Lately, lawmakers have been showing up to work sick. House Speaker Chip Nyman pointed that out.
Somebody said it sounded like we were in an ER in here, people are hacking and gagging and choking and carrying on.
Really, it's been a challenge avoiding the crud in this building, but the legislative process marches ahead. And this coming week, bills must clear first, second, and third votes in their full chamber of origin in order to stay alive. And a reminder for the folks at home, a bill has to go through the entire process in both chambers. So introduction, committee, 3 readings, and then on to the governor's desk.
Yeah, and we're smack dab in the week of carnage. It's like that movie, Kill Bill, the way these bills are dying. And it's exposing some fault lines, old guard versus new guard lawmakers, and of course, the content of the bills themselves. Not only are there differences with veterans versus newcomers' priorities, there's also different ideas about how the process should work. We'll get into all that, but a lot of the policy deaths we're seeing is because of Speaker Nyman's desk drawer, as you reported in a story this week, Maggie.
Correctamundo, Chris. So the speaker's drawer isn't an actual drawer in a desk. Instead, it's the lingo used to describe the speaker's unilateral prerogative to hold back bills. The body can override the speaker, but that requires a 2/3 vote.
Right, so here's our Civics 101 for the week. Before we get into death by mahogany drawer, let's go over a few ways bills can die.
So a bill can fail on a vote, whether that's in committee or on the floor, or lawmakers just don't get to them by a certain deadline, like we're seeing today with bills trying to get out of committee. And then there's the bucket of bills that die because the speaker's prerogative.
And as you reported, speakers have always left some bills to die on the vine, but Maggie, I think you're saying that this session, that's happening more than average.
It's at least more than the last 2 general sessions. As far as I know, most speakers have held back bills. But the drawer took on controversy during the last 2 years when the Freedom Caucus was really critical of former Speaker Albert Summers for keeping bills back. But I found in my own reporting that this year, Nyman held back 95 bills, which accounted for more than a quarter of all House bills. For comparison, Summers held back about 8% 2 years ago. So this year is a much higher proportion of House bills than under the last 2 speakers during a general session.
Wow. He had 95 bills, but a desire to bring them all to the floor ain't one.
Nice. So last fall, ahead of the general election, Nyman said he would use the drawer on a case-by-case basis. But he also hoped that every piece of legislation could get past introduction so lawmakers could debate. When I spoke to him, he chalked it up to multiple different issues: lengthy debate, dozens of brand new lawmakers, and trying to hit the Freedom Caucus's 5 and dime plan bills early, which he called heavy lifts.
Judge us based on the content of what got through.
So definitely an uptick in dead bills. They varied in subject, sponsorship, and complexity.
Most were from individual lawmakers. 14 were sponsored by legislative committees. Those dealt with a range of issues. Some were related to housing, education, corner crossing, and property taxes. Others had to do with elections, irrigation districts, and Wyoming's burgeoning gaming industry. Some of the lawmakers I spoke to were particularly concerned about the number of committee bills coming to such an abrupt end after being worked in the off-season.
Yeah, I've been hearing similar concerns. Lawmakers spend time crafting those bills during the off-season, like you said, or the interim. Our legislature only meets for a fraction of the year, but interim committees gavel in all year round, all across the state. That way, members of the public, agency heads, and other interested parties can field lawmakers' ideas for legislation that's already in the works or that could be. Some of those ideas end up becoming bill drafts, some go nowhere, but the vetting process requires time and taxpayer money. So in return, those bills are traditionally prioritized during sessions over measures sponsored by individual lawmakers. But in recent years, a bunch of new faces, coupled with the retirement of some well-known ones, has meant the process is changing. Representative Steve Harshman told me that after I caught up with him outside the House lobby.
Usually, the House operates like the Senate. You bring the non-controversial, the easy fixes, the committee-type bills first, and you knock those out. And because most of these bills are little problems that a constituent has brought to us, and they're pretty simple fixes, really are. And boy, you can knock out 40 things that right away in the first week that benefit our people and actually solve a problem and are not controversial.
He said that's not the strategy being used this year.
Or last year, or even the year before that. We first started to see this in the 2023 general session. I wrote a story back then about 6 committee bills dying when Nyman, the majority floor leader at the time, buried them at the bottom of the general file. Then last year, I reported on the Freedom Caucus using its voting bloc to kill 13 committee bills on day one when 2/3 support was needed. This year, House leadership is simply not prioritizing committee bills.
The conflict here is pretty fascinating to me. Either you play ball and prioritize committee bills the way it's often been done, the way I think some folks would argue works best and is most respectful to taxpayer dollars, or you buck that trend. We've got some newcomers this year who think of themselves more as disruptors. It's hard to say with 100% certainty that one method is objectively better than the other. So, Maggie, I'm curious what you've heard from lawmakers about these committee bills going the way of the dodo bird, south with the geese.
Well, for some lawmakers that I've spoken to, it's becoming a question of what's the point of the interim? What's the point of committees meeting in the offseason to craft bills, spend taxpayer dollars and stakeholder resources if the legislature is just going to kill those bills from the jump? That's something I heard from Minority Floor Leader Mike Yin at a press conference on Tuesday. I also spoke with Senator Kel Case. He's a Republican and the chairman of the Senate Corporations Committee. 4 of that committee's bills died in the Speaker's drawer. And that was a disappointment for Case, but also a source of confusion. These were what Case called no-brainer bills. One would have created reporting requirements for insurance fraud. Another would have updated the bidding requirements for irrigation districts. One other lawmaker I'll mention is Representative Trey Sherwood. She's a Democrat and a House Appropriations Committee member. She told me that that committee dedicated a lot of time and resources this offseason to hearing public testimony and crafting bills for Wyoming's gaming industry. That was a heavy interim lift, but was meant to create some uniformity in the regulatory framework and protections for the public. And again, those 4 committee bills died in the Speaker's drawer.
But the mass culling that happened in the House doesn't seem to be happening in the Senate.
No, it does not. Senate President Bo Biteman introduced and referred all 208 Senate files to committees. I haven't gotten a chance to speak with the president about this, but Case commended Biteman for doing so.
There's also fewer newbies in that chamber. In the House, there's 23 first-time legislators, and that's having an impact on the process of lawmaking, something I reported on this week. Longtime lawmakers like Lander Representative Lloyd Larson say they're lending a hand to help educate freshmen on procedures and history. Larson is a 12-year veteran of the House.
When we get up and talk and debate a bill, it's like having your teenager in the car and teaching them to drive. There's just some experience. They're going into the turns too fast. They're not stopping at the stop signs. And so there's an education process that we all have to go through.
On some bills, Larson says his veteran status allows him to point to similar legislation that previously failed and share context.
Right. That's something my colleague Andrew Graham has been noticing. He's got a unique way of seeing the legislature since he returned to the state after being away for a few years. The Freedom Caucus was not in charge when he was a reporter here before, so he asked House leadership at a press conference last week about the role of lawmakers like Larson, as well as Republican veterans like Representatives Steve Harshman and Bob Nicholas.
But Speaker Nyman says even though he appreciates the intent, all that educating is slowing things down. Nyman has been in the House for 4 years.
I mean, it's called a filibuster, if we want to just get right down to it. But that's all part of the process.
Nyman's view is that the longer floor debate goes on, the less bills will survive as a host of key deadlines near, including priority legislation for the Freedom Caucus. But Harshman says what he and other legislators are doing isn't intended to delay or kill bills. It's vetting.
I'm not going to sit there and watch all this go without saying something. That's not what I was elected to do.
Bills have also been dying because committees or chambers are voting them down. For example, I was keeping my eye on 2 mirror bills to ban all electronic voting equipment, so replacing the machines with hand counting all ballots. So a big change to Wyoming's election systems, and something the state Republican Party has been interested in. But both of those bills died after some very long committee meetings, one of which went late into the night this week. There's a slim chance they could be resurrected, and that's true for any piece of failed legislation. In fact, we've already seen a couple zombie bills this session.
And I was surprised to see the Medical Ethics Defense Act die. It would have allowed hospitals and physicians to decline providing medical care, like abortion, if it conflicts with their religious or moral beliefs. We're seeing quite a few of the other abortion restrictions clear important hurdles in both chambers, so I did expect the same to be true for this bill.
Let's end on what's still alive. What are you watching, Chris?
I'll be watching a bunch of these bills banning transgender folks from bathrooms and public spaces in certain sports teams. I'll be keeping an eye on election bills too, like one that would require hand count audits of some elections, and another that would ban all ballot drop boxes. And of course, how President Trump's executive orders play into all that. And you, Maggie?
The budget. I'm wondering how far apart will the Senate and the House land?
Well, we'll be back next Friday with updates on that. Thanks for listening to the Cheyenne Roundup, your weekly look at what lawmakers are up to during the 2025 legislative session from Wyoming Public Radio and WyoFile. New episodes drop every Friday throughout the session. Editing and producing by Tennessee Watson and Nikki Willett. Follow our ongoing legislative coverage at wyomingpublicmedia.org and wyofile.com. And thanks again for listening.